Why are you going to try and leave America in 2027?
So I think the United States is going through a very difficult time right now. And I think most people understand that. Uh, we are a young country. No matter how much we think that we are the best in the world, we are actually going through the early part of our adolescence as a nation. And you can see it playing out every day in the headlines. You can see it in our role in geopolitical events. You can see that we're suffering in terms of trying to identify ourselves. We don't know, do we want to be a real democracy? Do we want to be kind of a partial democracy? Do we want to treat everybody as equal? Do we not want to treat everybody as equal? We're struggling in the same way that you and I did through middle school, right? My children mean the world to me. And what I want to do is give them a life where they have the choice to do anything they want to do. Unfortunately, I don't believe our country for the next 5 to 10 years is going to be the kind of country that allows children of today to choose and be whatever they want to be. I think our country has some growing up of its own to do before we really offer people equal access to opportunities. So for me, if I was my 11-year-old son, when I turned 15 or 16 years old and I start to really care about something, I would like to be in a place where I can explore that thing. I don't think that's going to be in the United States. I think that's going to be in Europe. I think that's going to be in the Middle East. I think that's going to be in Latin America, where he will have all the advantages of the world outside of the United States.
What do you think about what's going on at the moment with geopolitics as it relates to like China and the US? There's a bit of a power struggle going on, and there has been, but a lot of people forecast that China is eventually going to overtake, or maybe it already has, the US as the sort of global economic force. Um, are you preparing for that? Do you think it's going to happen?
I think that there's two realistic outcomes and there's one less realistic outcome. The most realistic outcome is that the United States and China continue to compete and reach parity, equality with each other. That's the most realistic outcome. Maybe the United States remains 10% bigger. Maybe China gets 2% bigger economically, but they approach parity. They approach equality. I don't want to live in the United States when it loses so much status that another country reaches economic parity. Think about that for a second. The world is accustomed to one superpower. Once there are two superpowers, everything changes. There's two massive languages, and you're going to have to choose which language you speak. There's two currencies. Which currency are you going to save your money in? There's competing priorities. There's competing politics. There's equally massive, sophisticated militaries. When you are in one of those two countries, at the moment that they reach parity, you are in the most dangerous position because the number one target for China will be the United States. The number one target for the United States will be China. Right now, there's not parity, there's not equality. So the United States has to worry about everybody. And China doesn't really have to worry about many people at all. But as that equality gets closer and closer, there's more and more threat. Think about it in business terms. When you're the industry leader in your business,
Google.
You don't have to worry about much. You have to worry about all the little guys, but nobody's really a direct threat. But as soon as somebody else rises to meet you, you have to worry about it. The leader used to be Yahoo, right? Yahoo had to see what it's like to lose and gain parity with Google, only to then be eclipsed, right? So most probable outcome, we reach parity. Second most probable outcome is that China does supersede us by small amounts, right? 5% GDP, 10% GDP. And the United States has to regain its momentum to try to gain back the edge. So now you have this cycle back and forth, right? Where for 5 years, China is the leading GDP. For 5 years, the United States is the leading GDP. And you have this waffling back and forth, which makes you even less secure than if you were in direct parity. But that's a scary place to be as well. You still have to lose all the influence to get there. And when you're there, you never know how long it's going to last.
Do you think we're already engaged in a form of World War III?
Yeah, absolutely. I think World War III is already happening. I think World War III is not what people think it was going to be. I think people were afraid that World War III was somehow going to look like another World War II. Instead, World War III is a war of proxy nations. It's a war where smaller third world countries are competing against each other, and they're being funded by larger countries that are actually in conflict with one another. Ukraine and Russia. US is funding Ukraine. Russia's obviously taking care of itself. But the real conflict in Ukraine isn't about Ukraine. It's about the West versus Russia. The same thing's going to happen with Taiwan and China. When the time comes that China makes its biggest move on Taiwan, it's already made the small moves on Taiwan. When it makes its largest move on Taiwan, it's going to become a question of China versus the West and whoever supports Taiwan.
Has your experience over the last, I don't know, 20, 30 years really made you rethink and look at the world entirely differently? Because if you are so focused and able to detect and understand messaging and narrative, you must just see it everywhere you go in everything you do.
Right. So there were two big aha moments for me. And the first was in the very beginning parts of my training at CIA. I mean, when I went through all of the CIA recruiting process and all of my time in the military, I just felt like I was doing the right thing. I just felt like I was doing a good job. I felt like I was special, right? Like, wow, I must be super special because I'm getting picked for the National Clandestine Service. So I felt like I was doing everything right. And then I actually ended up going through my training program where they confirmed that I actually was broken in certain ways. I was high performing because I had trauma as a child. I lie and I steal and I have no problem with sociopathy because I'm not mentally healthy, right? Like that's basically what they confirmed. Like you're wired in a certain way that's really useful, but you're actually not neurotypical. You're not successful in the way that you thought you were successful, but you are still very useful. And oh, by the way, you're even more special because now you work for CIA. So don't ever stop working for CIA because they know that what drives us is our ideology, right? Our ideology and then our ego. So they hook us that way. So for me, that was my first big aha moment because up until then, I always thought maybe I understood the world, but nobody else seemed to understand it the way I understood it. Like I could see the hypocrisy in high school and I could see the hypocrisy in my mom and my dad, and they would do things that were different than what they would tell me to do. And I don't understand, how is the customer always right? But then like sometimes the company wins the lawsuit. Like it doesn't make sense. How is there a legal structure, but criminals don't go to jail if there's a legal structure? Like I remember seeing it all and thinking that it didn't make sense, but never actually being confident enough to say anything about it because it was a secret and I didn't feel comfortable sharing that secret. CIA then taught me what you're seeing is actually the world as it really is. And let's train you to show you and give you a vocabulary to understand what you're seeing. Let's teach you about human psychology so you understand why it works the way that it works, why everybody sees it and nobody talks about it. Right. So that was my first big aha moment. And then my second big aha moment came when I left CIA and I was unemployed for like 6 months living in my in-laws' converted garage with a 1-year-old child, wondering how the fuck I did so many things so wrong that I couldn't get a job, even though I was just part of the CIA. And in that time, feeling like just the world's biggest loser, the only skill that I could lean on was what the CIA had taught me to do. So then I lied my way into a Fortune 10 company, and all of a sudden I wasn't a loser anymore. And once I realized that I could use CIA skills to succeed in business, that was my second big aha moment. So now everything I see through a lens of CIA skills in a business world.
Perception versus perspective was one of the other things that I've heard you talk about. Was quite a big, I guess, shift in understanding, but something that the regular person doesn't really understand.
Yeah. So the idea of perception and perspective, I have to define them first, right? Perception is what you believe you see. Where you sit is how you perceive the world around you. Perspective is how other people see where you're sitting. So when I think about us right now across the table from each other, my perception is what I see of you. Your perspective is very different than my perception. right? At a minimum, I'm looking at you with a background that's different than when you're looking at me with a background. So the benefit, the advantage that CIA gives its field officers is that it trains us to recognize and distrust our perception, because perception really only comes from one source, and that is your own five senses. You are the source of information for your perception. So for anybody who's ever seen like a little pile of socks in the lower left-hand corner and they thought it was a rat and they jump until they realize it's socks, that is your perception lying to you. Perspective means that you get data objectively from the world around you. So if you're in your room and you see a pile of black in the corner, your perspective tells you, this is your room. There's never been a rat in your room ever before. That pile in the corner is probably something like socks. Your perspective keeps things objective. Perception makes things very subjective or very emotional. So CIA trains us to lean into our perspective, gain perspective, think about things objectively, because if you lean on your perception, you're leaning on emotions, and emotions are very likely wrong.
If you love the Diary of a CEO brand and you watch this channel, please do me a huge favor. Become part of the 15% of the viewers on this channel that have hit the subscribe button. It helps us tremendously, and the bigger the channel gets, the bigger the guests.